You wake up in the middle of the night in medieval London. You need to go. But there's no bathroom down the hall, no toilet, no running water, just a clay pot in the corner of a dark room. And outside, a city that smells like something you don't want to think about too hard. This was real life for hundreds of millions of people for over 1,000 years. And the way they dealt with it is equal parts ingenious, disgusting, and genuinely fascinating. This video is about medieval sanitation. What people actually did with human waste before plumbing existed. And I'll warn you right now, the answer is way more complicated than they just threw it in the street. Some of what they built was surprisingly smart. Some of it was horrifying. And one particular job that existed in medieval towns is so bad that I'm almost embarrassed to tell you about it. Almost. Let's start with the thing everyone gets wrong. Most people assume medieval people were just completely clueless about waste, that they lived in filth without a second thought. But that's not really true. They understood, at least instinctively, that waste caused problems. They just had very limited tools to deal with it. And the solutions they came up with tell you a lot about how creative humans get when they're desperate. The most common setup in a medieval home was the chamber pot. Simple clay or wooden pot. You kept it in your bedroom. You used it at night when going outside wasn't safe or practical. And in the morning, you dealt with it. In smaller towns and rural areas, you'd empty it into a pit in your yard, or onto your garden, or into a nearby ditch. In cities, some people just opened their window and threw it into the street. There were actually laws against this in many places. London had ordinances as early as the 1300s, telling people not to dump waste from windows. Did people follow them? Sometimes, not always. But here's what's more interesting than the chamber pot. The privy? A privy was essentially a medieval toilet. A wooden seat built over a hole in the ground, or over a river, or in some cases, hanging directly over a moat. Wealthier households had dedicated privy chambers, small rooms built specifically for this purpose. Castles had something called a garderobe, which was a stone seat built into the wall of the castle, with a shaft that dropped straight down the exterior wall. The waste fell into the moat, or onto the ground below. And yes, this created a serious problem for castle defenders. Historians have documented at least one case where attackers climbed up through the garderobe shaft to get inside a castle. The castle at Chateau Gaillard in France fell partly because of this exact vulnerability in 1204. Someone crawled up through the toilet shaft. Medieval warfare was not glamorous, but that's important. And here's why it matters in the bigger picture. Even the wealthiest people in the most fortified buildings in the world were dealing with waste in ways that created new problems they hadn't anticipated. The privy was better than nothing. But better than nothing isn't the same as good. Now, we get to the cesspits. This is where things get genuinely interesting. Under most medieval buildings in any significant town, there were cesspits, deep holes lined with stone or brick, designed to collect waste over time. Think of them as primitive septic tanks. They worked reasonably well for a while. A household cesspit might last a few years before it needed to be emptied. And when it did need to be emptied, that's when one of history's most unpleasant professions came into play. Gong farmers. That was the actual job title. Gong farmers were hired to climb down into cesspits at night, always at night, because the smell and the sight of it was considered too offensive for daylight hours, and physically remove the waste by hand, bucket by bucket. They hauled it out, loaded it onto carts, and transported it outside the city walls to designated dumping areas. Or they sold it to farmers as fertilizer, which we'll get to in a moment. These men were paid extremely well by medieval standards, because obviously, some records show gong farmers earning several times the daily wage of a common labourer. But they were also socially isolated. They lived on the outskirts of town. They weren't allowed in certain areas. And the work itself was genuinely dangerous. Methane gas builds up in enclosed spaces full of decomposing organic matter. Gong farmers occasionally suffocated or were overcome by fumes while working in deep pits. There's a record from 1,326 inches London of a man named Richard the Raker who fell through a rotted wooden floor into his own cesspit and drowned. The historical record describes it in terms that suggest contemporaries found it both tragic and darkly ironic. That's the kind of detail that makes history feel real. But here's the part that surprises most people. The waste didn't just disappear. It went somewhere useful. In rural areas especially, human and animal waste was a critical agricultural resource. Medieval farmers understood that waste made crops grow. They called it night soil when it came from humans, and they applied it to fields the same way modern farmers use fertilizer. Because that's exactly what it was. The chemistry wasn't understood yet. But the results were obvious. Fields treated with waste produced better harvests. So gong farmers weren't just disposal workers. They were part of a supply chain that fed people. That's the thing about medieval sanitation that changes how you see it. It wasn't just a problem to be managed. It was a resource to be moved around. Waste left a city. It went to fields. Fields grew food. Food came back to the city. A crude cycle, yes, but a cycle. The cities, though, were still a mess. London's Thames River was, by the 14th century, essentially an open sewer. Tanneries, slaughterhouses, and privies all drained into it. The same river people used for drinking water. Paris had similar problems. So did every major European city, and the consequences were predictable and catastrophic. The Black Death, which killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population in the mid-1300s, was bubonic plague spread by fleas on rats, and rats thrive in environments full of waste and rotting organic matter. The sanitation crisis didn't cause the plague directly, but it created exactly the conditions where plague could explode. The smell of medieval London in summer was reportedly so bad that Parliament had to be temporarily suspended on multiple occasions because members couldn't function in the heat. That's not a joke. That actually happened. The Great Stink of London is usually associated with 1858, but the problem started centuries earlier. Now, if you're watching this thinking, this is the most disgusting thing I've ever heard, I want to push back on that a little. Because here's what's actually remarkable. Medieval people built systems, imperfect, often revolting systems, but systems. Monks in monasteries designed elaborate drainage channels that routed waste away from living areas. Some monasteries had running water diverted from nearby streams to flush their latrines continuously. The monasteries of Canterbury and Christchurch had sanitation infrastructure in the 12th century that was genuinely impressive for its time. Channels, pipes, settling tanks. They were solving the same problem engineers solve today, just with stone and gravity instead of PVC and pumps. Castles with garderobes position them downwind of the main living quarters when possible. City planners in medieval towns often put tanneries and slaughterhouses at the downstream end of rivers so the waste flowed away from the population, not through it. These weren't accidents. People were thinking about this. They were making choices based on observation and logic. They just didn't have germ theory yet. They didn't know what a bacterium was. They knew waste smelled bad and that people who lived near it got sick more often. They just didn't know exactly why. If you're finding this as fascinating as I am, drop a comment below with the most surprising thing you've learned so far. And if you want to keep going down this rabbit hole, subscribe. I cover exactly this kind of history that you never got in school. The stuff that makes the past feel like a place real people actually lived in. So here's the big picture. Medieval sanitation was three things at once. It was a daily inconvenience that everyone lived with. It was a public health crisis that killed people on a massive scale. And it was a genuine engineering challenge that some very clever people made serious attempts to solve. The chamber pot wasn't laziness. It was the best available technology for nighttime use in an era before electric lights and indoor plumbing. The cesspit wasn't ignorance, it was a deliberate containment strategy. The gong farmer wasn't a sign of a broken society. He was a specialised professional, filling a critical role in urban infrastructure. What medieval people did with their waste before plumbing existed was exactly what humans have always done with every problem. They improvised, they adapted, they built systems with whatever they had. Some of those systems were disgusting. Some were surprisingly sophisticated. And all of them were solving the same problem you solve every morning without thinking about it. The difference is, you have a flush toilet, and they had a man who climbed into a pit at midnight for extra pay. And honestly, after learning what that job involved, the extra pay still doesn't seem like enough.